Hey guys, today I'm going to be reading Chapter 3 of Who Was Sally Ride by Megan Stein and illustrated by Ted Hammond. When the space program started in the late 1950s, there were only 7 astronauts. They were all military test pilots who tried out the newest and fastest planes being made. Choosing pilots as astronauts made sense in the early days of the space program. For one thing, nobody had ever flown into space before 1961. Space travel seemed dangerous. NASA wanted pilots who were used to dangerous missions. For another thing, the first space capsules were so tiny, there was no room for extra passengers. Every astronaut had to be a pilot. But by 1977, things had changed. NASA had sent more than 20 men to the moon. More space flights were taking place each year, and now NASA was planning to build a new kind of spacecraft, the Space Shuttle. It would be much bigger than the old space capsules, big enough to carry 5, 6, or maybe even 7 astronauts at a time. This meant that scientists, doctors, and engineers could go into space, not just pilots. Scientists could find out how space affected all living things. Engineers could help launch satellites into space. Satellites are pieces of equipment that circle around the Earth. Some of them take pictures of Earth's weather. Others send back TV, radio, and telephone signals to Earth. To do this work, NASA needed more astronauts for the Space Shuttle program. And thanks to the women's movement, everyone at NASA knew it was time to include women in the job. NASA ran the ad for astronauts in dozens of college newspapers across the country. Sally wasn't the only person from Stanford who applied. So did lots of her friends. Of them, out of more than 8,000 applications, about 6,500 were from men and 1,500 were from women. NASA read each person's application. By October 1977, they decided to interview 208 people. Sally Ride was one of them. That month, Sally flew to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, where NASA had its headquarters. There, Sally saw how unusual it was for women to be part of the space program. In a later interview, she estimated that there were 4,000 people working in science and technology jobs in Houston. Only 4 of them were women. The women's rights movement. In the 1950s, when Sally Ride was growing up, most women didn't have paying jobs. They stayed at home and took care of their children, or they held jobs that were thought as women's jobs, such as teachers, secretaries, and nurses. Men called women the weaker sex. A common saying at the time was, "A woman's place is in the home." But by the 1960s and 70s, things were changing. Women wanted the same careers that men had as lawyers, doctors, airplane pilots, and business owners. Women wanted to be treated fairly at work, to be paid the same as men doing the same jobs. To protest the problem, women marched in the streets. There were rallies for women's liberation. Gloria Steinem, Germaine Greer, and other feminists, as they called themselves, wrote books and articles to make people think about the issue of women's rights. Other people talked about burning their bras as a symbol of freedom. Society changed, NASA did too, and began to seek out women as astronauts. Sally's job interview lasted a week. First, she was given a physical exam. Her hearing and vision were tested. She had to run on a treadmill to test her heart rate. She also had to spend time inside a round fabric-coated ball to prove she could handle being in a small, cramped space. Sally was physically fit, and she was the right height too. She was 5 feet 5 inches. Astronauts couldn't be too tall, or they wouldn't fit inside the space shuttle. The physical tests weren't as important as the personal interviews. NASA asked Sally a lot of questions about her life. 2 psychiatrists also talked to Sally to find out whether she was the right kind of person for the job. One was friendly and nice. The other was what Sally called the bad guy psychiatrist, who tried to rattle you. But Sally Ride couldn't be rattled easily. She was always calm under pressure. Those were the qualities NASA wanted. NASA was looking for people who were intelligent. Sally was certainly smart. She'd be able to handle tricky situations and solve problems that might come up during a spaceflight. NASA also wanted astronauts who were team players. Sally knew how to be part of a team from playing sports with boys. During the interview, NASA told Sally that the training would take several years. She would have to work very hard. She would have to give up being an astrophysicist while learning to become an astronaut. And after all of the years of training, there was no guarantee that Sally would ever go into space. Sally didn't mind any of that. She really wanted the job. After the interview, she flew home to California to wait. Months went by and she didn't hear anything. But finally, in January 1978, she got the call she'd been hoping for. She'd been picked to be one of NASA's 35 new astronauts. In July 1978, she and the others in her class reported to Houston to begin training. They called themselves 35 New Guys, or TFNG for short, even though Sally and 5 others were women. First woman in space. Long before the U.S. ever thought of having women astronauts, the Soviet Union sent a woman into space. Her name was Valentina Tereshkova. A former factory worker, Valentina was chosen to be a cosmonaut. A cosmonaut, the Russian word for astronaut, partly because she was an amateur skydiver. Valentina flew in a Russian spacecraft in 1963. She spent almost 3 days in space, circling the Earth 48 times. She became a heroine to the Russian people, remembered even today. Later that year, she married another Russian cosmonaut. When they had a baby girl, their daughter was the first person ever born of 2 parents who had both traveled in space.